Ask anyone, anywhere in the world, to name a cigar, and there's a good chance they'll say the same word: Cuban. Not a specific brand, not a specific size, just Cuban, as if the word itself were the promise. For most of the last 60 years, you couldn't legally buy one in the country that smokes more cigars than almost anywhere else on Earth, and somehow that only made people want them more. So what actually happened here? Is a Cuban cigar simply the best tobacco money can buy, grown in a place no other country can copy? Or is a huge part of that reputation something else entirely, a story repeated for 6 decades about a small island that got cut off from the world's biggest market and quietly turned scarcity into legend? The real answer is more interesting than either version, and understanding it changes how you hold a cigar, no matter where it was rolled. Long before Havana had a single cigar factory, tobacco was already growing wild across the island, and the people who lived there had already figured out how to cure it, roll it, and smoke it. When Christopher Columbus's crew came ashore in 1492, they watched the native Taíno people smoking tightly rolled bundles of dried leaves. They called that bundle a Cohiba. Europeans had never seen anything like it. It took Europe more than a century to fall in love with tobacco, but once it did, one region of Cuba quietly became the standard the rest of the world would spend the next 400 years trying to reach. It's called Vuelta Abajo, a narrow strip of land in the far west of the island where the soil is unusually rich and the microclimate is almost impossible to replicate. Farmers elsewhere can plant the exact same seed in soil that looks nearly identical, and the leaf still comes out different.
That difference has a name: terroir. And in Vuelta Abajo, it became the foundation of an entire industry's reputation. Not all of that tobacco is grown the same way either. Some fields are left completely open to the sun, producing thicker, darker, more intensely flavored leaves used mostly for filler and binder. Others are covered with fine cloth that filters the sunlight, coaxing the plant into growing thinner, more delicate leaves prized for wrapping the outside of a cigar. Farmers had been refining both methods for generations before anyone wrote a word of it down, simply by watching what the plant did and adjusting, season after season, harvest after harvest. By the 1800s, Havana wasn't just producing cigars. It was producing an idea of luxury. European royalty, American industrialists, and anyone who wanted to signal that they had arrived ordered their cigars from Cuba. Factories in Havana employed thousands of torcedores, the rollers whose hands could shape a cigar in under a minute, and cigar labels became some of the most elaborate artwork of the era, printed to convince a buyer, before they'd even opened the box, that what was inside was worth the price. Some of the names built during that era are still on cigar boxes today. Partagas opened its doors in Havana in 1845. H. Upmann followed in 1844, founded by a German banker who discovered he could ship cigars to Europe alongside his banknotes, and quietly built one of the most recognized names in the business. These weren't yet global brands built by marketing departments. They were family workshops that happened to get very, very good at one thing. By the time the 20th century began, Havana wasn't just a place anymore. It had become a grade of quality.
But almost nobody understood exactly what happened behind those factory doors to earn that reputation. Making a great cigar was never as simple as rolling a leaf. It started in the fields, where tobacco was hand-picked, leaf by leaf, over weeks. Then came curing, weeks spent hanging in wooden barns until the green leaf slowly turned brown. After that, fermentation, where the leaves were stacked into tall piles called pilones and left to heat naturally, sometimes for months, breaking down ammonia and sugar until the tobacco was finally ready to age. Some leaves rested for years before anyone ever touched them again. Only then did a roller, trained for years before being trusted with premium tobacco, began shaping filler, binder, and wrapper into a finished cigar by hand. Every stage existed to remove imperfection, and every stage took time nobody was allowed to rush. There's one more detail almost nobody outside the industry knows. The wrapper, the single outer leaf wrapped around the finished cigar, is a tiny fraction of the tobacco inside, yet master blenders will tell you it shapes most of what you actually taste. A cigar can be built from nearly identical filler tobacco and taste completely different depending on which wrapper leaf goes around it. It's often the difference between a cigar that tastes bright and peppery and one that tastes like dark chocolate and coffee, and almost none of that difference comes from what's hidden inside. That reputation would soon collide with a revolution that changed who controlled it. In 1959, Fidel Castro's revolutionary government took power in Cuba, and within 2 years, the state nationalized the country's privately owned cigar factories, the same family businesses that had spent generations building Havana's name.
Owners who refused to hand over their companies fled the island, many of them landing in the Dominican Republic, Honduras, and Nicaragua with almost nothing but the knowledge in their hands. That single decision would end up reshaping the entire global cigar industry, though almost nobody realized it at the time. A few years later, in the mid-1960s, one of Castro's own bodyguards was seen smoking an unusually fragrant, unbranded cigar. When Castro asked where it came from, he was introduced to the roller behind it, a man named Eduardo Rivera. Castro liked what he tasted so much that a small factory, El Laguito, was set up specifically to keep making it, for him alone. For 16 years, that cigar didn't have a public name and couldn't be bought anywhere on Earth. It was reserved for Castro and handed out as a diplomatic gift to visiting heads of state. In 1982, the Cuban government finally allowed the world to buy it. They called it Cohiba, the old Taíno word for tobacco itself, and it instantly became the most prestigious cigar in the world, largely because almost nobody had ever been allowed to have one. But by then, the cigar that would define Cuban luxury had already missed its biggest market by 20 years. In February of 1962, President John F. Kennedy was preparing to sign a total trade embargo against Cuba, cutting off nearly every Cuban product from American shelves, including cigars. According to his press secretary, Pierre Salinger, Kennedy had one piece of unfinished business first. The night before he signed the order, he asked Salinger to track down as many of his favorite Cuban cigars as he could find. Salinger returned the next morning with 1,200 H. Upmann Petite Coronas. Only after they were safely inside the White House did Kennedy sign the embargo that made every Cuban cigar illegal in the United States, starting February 7, 1962. It's one of the great ironic images in cigar history. The most powerful man in the country was stocking up on the exact product he was about to ban for everyone else. For the next several decades, Cuban cigars became something almost nobody in America could legally taste, which is precisely what turned them into legend. Nothing manufacturers desire quite like being told you can't have something. Duty-free shops in Europe and the Caribbean did steady business selling Cuban cigars to American tourists who smuggled them home in suitcases like contraband because, legally, that's exactly what they were. The embargo didn't just create a black market, it created folklore. Every traveler who'd ever tried a Cohiba in Havana or Paris became an unofficial ambassador for a product most Americans had never legally touched, and the fewer people who could get one, the more valuable the story became. That folklore had a dark side, and it still does. Oliven's, the Cuban state company that controls the brand, has spent years fighting a flood of counterfeits. Street vendors near Havana's hotels and countless sellers online have built a quiet industry out of gluing a Cohiba band onto ordinary tobacco and charging tourists a premium for the story alone. Experienced smokers will tell you that a large share of the Cuban cigars sold to visitors on the street were never made in a licensed factory at all. The mystique became so valuable that people started selling the mystique itself, with nothing genuine attached to it.
Meanwhile, in Exile, the families who had built Cuba's cigar industry in the first place were quietly rebuilding it somewhere else. Cuban seed tobacco was planted in the Dominican Republic. Cuban rolling techniques, passed down inside displaced families for generations, took root in Honduras and Nicaragua. The people who knew exactly how to make a world-class cigar simply started doing it outside of Cuba, using everything they had learned before the revolution. Within a generation, some of the most respected cigars in the world weren't Cuban at all. They were made by Cuban hands, or the descendants of Cuban hands, using Cuban knowledge on soil that had never been part of Cuba. So here's the question that actually matters. Are Cuban cigars still the best in the world because of what's in the soil? Or is a large part of that reputation simply the story you just heard? The honest answer is both, and neither one alone. Vuelta Abajo's soil really is exceptional, and nothing else on Earth grows tobacco exactly like it. That part isn't myth. But blind tastings conducted by cigar publications over the past several decades have repeatedly shown something the mystique doesn't want you to hear. Non-Cuban cigars, grown from Cuban seed by Cuban expertise in Nicaragua and the Dominican Republic, now regularly beat Cuban cigars in head-to-head comparisons. The soil matters. It was never the whole story. Today, the descendants of that exiled generation run some of the most awarded cigar operations on earth in places nobody would have associated with premium tobacco 60 years ago. Esteli, in northern Nicaragua, has become a production hub that regularly produces cigars ranked among the best in the world by the same critics who once treated non-Cuban tobacco as an afterthought.
Santiago, in the Dominican Republic, does the same. None of that happened by accident. It happened because the people who understood Cuban tobacco left Cuba and kept working. Which means the real reason Cuban cigars became the most famous in the world isn't just agriculture, and it isn't just marketing. It's a chain of very human events. A native word for tobacco, a soil nobody else can copy, a revolution that scattered expertise across an entire hemisphere, a cigar made in secret for one man, and a president who banned a product only after making sure he wouldn't run out of it himself. It's a smaller, harder question. Who grew this tobacco? Who fermented it? Who aged it? And who spent years learning how to roll it properly? Sometimes the honest answer to that question happens to be Havana. Increasingly, it doesn't have to be. Understanding that changes how you see a cigar, no matter where it was rolled. The band on the outside doesn't tell you the whole story anymore. The story is bigger than the island where it started, and today it belongs to every hand that learned the craft from someone who once called Havana home.